University of Saskatchewan. Along with co-chair Mabiana Camargo, a doctoral student who studies speculative literatures, I'm delighted to welcome you to the second live event in our online conference. And I'm just going to spotlight Mabiana here for a minute so she can say hello as well. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second live event of our online conference, 2021 Visions, Speculating in Literature and Film in Canada, hosted here at the University of Saskatchewan. We join you today as guests on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations, including Cree, Dene, Nakota, Ojibwe, and Saulteaux, and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationships with one another. The event today, Visual Speculations, features two Saskatoon artists, including the artist whose spectacular painting, The Plastic Age, you see on our website and publicity. This session is chaired by Jake Moore. And Jake, if you could, we'll just bring you up here. And Jake Moore, and Jake is head of art galleries and art collection at our university. Jake's an intermedia artist who works at the intersection of material, gesture, text, and vocality in exhibitions and other public interventions. Her primary medium is space and its occupation, and thus her artistic practice includes her administrative projects in galleries such as the ones at the university, which change the form and volume of public spaces. So I'm going to turn things over to Jake to introduce our panelists and introduce the panel itself. And before I do, I want to apologize again for our brief delay. We had a little bit of technical difficulties in allowing and welcoming our panelists. So all is well, we're ready to go. And thank you very much, Jake.
Thank you. So to begin with, I would like to thank Wendy Roy and the organizing committee for this opportunity to stake out a small piece of imagined territory to discuss how those of us that operate outside of language in our creative practices engage in speculative fictions, narrative structures, and critical fabulation. I'd also very much like to thank Iris Hauser and Laura St-Pierre for joining me in this space, and I look very much forward to their presentations. Just some housekeeping. Each will share with us their work for about 20 minutes. And I would ask that you hold your questions until they've both spoken, but assure you that there will be time for discussion. And I will re-speak your questions from the chat and look forward to what may come into the room in this way. It can be argued that all works of art are fiction. They are stories told in order to bring into being something that does not yet exist, including the relationships between us. They are fictions imagined that then travel through the maker's body into a shareable form and never, even in media like photography and photorealistic painting, replicate the subject of their imagining, as their materiality and its social history augment and filter the receiver's capacity to understand the image or object as the original thing or the person. And they operate outside of time. Time traveling is something that all art does, regardless of medium, as it persistently arrives in the impossible now. While works of art are always tethered to their makers and are evidence of the maker's worldviews, the works have their own vocality. Medievalist Paul Zumthor refers to vocalité as the persistent evidence of the body, voice, and the intended modality of medieval poetry that remains latent in the poems that were meant to be spoken aloud. So, story transmogrified into written language carries with it the resonant echo of the bodies that might have spoken it aloud, retracing from memory the shapes of the sounds we call language, that oscillate into meaning when received by another. This materialization of the voice into text lays bare how all matter is storied. Serpil Oppenheim states that what makes matter storied is narrative agency, a non-linguistic performance inherent in every material formation, from bodies to their atoms, making them telling or storied. These shifts in materiality and temporality are are held still momentarily in works of art before tumbling into the impossible now, which is always a fictive space. When Cherie Dimaline outlined so clearly the necessity to focus on nuance, something so difficult when all our resources are focused on external defense, she proposed that we recognize that solutions can originate from that very same nuance. For that subtleties and excesses of difference run counter to the capitalist project and its extractive modalities of being. Drawing again from Cherie's retelling of Maria Campbell via Erica Violet Lee regarding artistic praxis, quote, "We build what could have been, what should have been, if it had not been interrupted by colonialism." As colonials, now several generations that are defined by the epigenetic inheritance of colonialism, we suffer from the streamlining and homogenization demanded by modernity and delivered within the settler colonial project. It's a failure of imagination to not see potential solutions outside of binary limitations. We need artworks that speak to our multiple sensoria, engage the imagination, and call to the body so that we might remember the stories of the matter we are part of and the matter that we are. It is my pleasure then to introduce two artists that actively engage in this fictive practice of storied matter to lead to a more detailed and nuanced world. So from that point, from that positioning, I wanted to start with an introduction to Iris Hauser, and then Iris will present for us some works of her own and her own position. Then I'll introduce Laura Saint-Pierre, who will again bring us some of her work to consider, and then we'll join again for a conversation between us all. So Iris Hauser, if you don't know, is a Saskatoon painter, and her paintings are notable for their use of narrative, realism, and non-conventional symbolism. They depict human faces and bodies, but also landscapes and mystical, often disturbing imagery, inviting viewers to reflect on a collective sense of humanity. The Plastic Age, that's featured on the conference webpage and program, is a powerful speculative representation of a world out of balance. Hauser has taught art through the Mendel Art Gallery and the University of Saskatchewan Certificate Art and Design Program. She's an active member of Saskatchewan's art community, having served on the board of Carfax Saskatchewan and as a juror for the organization of Saskatchewan Arts Council. Welcome, Iris.
Thank you so much, Jake. First of all, I really thank everybody that's showed up for this. It's wonderful to share all of these ideas with other people. And I really wanted to put out a thank you to the organizing committee. It is wonderful to be included as visual artists in a very literary conference, because I do think there's a lot of similarity and interest. And I particularly wanted to thank the organizing committee, and especially Professor Roy, without whom there would be no visuals for me, because I'm very computer inept, and she's been wonderfully supportive and helpful. So thank you to everyone, and especially Professor Roy. I really appreciated the introduction and also the general, very beautiful erudite exposition that Jake Moore has just presented us with. Gave a lot of things to think about. And she actually mentioned a lot of things that I was really wanting to start talking about with my work, in that that sense of the nuance and the subtlety and the levels. And I think art, literature, and visual art are very similar in that way. That they can be very simple. They can be just entertainment, or a pleasant illustration of something, but they can also be incredibly complex, richly layered. And I think the best work has everything. It's got entertainment and pleasure and yet complex, rich, deep ideas behind it. So I do think it's very interesting to be part of this literary community and feel like the visual part is also being noticed. So that's very nice. Thank you very much. So I guess I'll get right into the images. Now, this is always the dangerous part. I actually have to press a button and make something happen. So let's see if it works. I've never done screen sharing before, so it's kind of a new thing for me. So I think it worked. And now I have to hit the start button, which I don't find anywhere. Maybe it's this one.
Actually, Iris, you're good. You're good to go.
It worked. So thank you very much, Wendy. She was wonderful at holding my hand through this because I'm not a computer person. I'm very much a hands-on person. So this is, of course, all of you would have seen this image as part of the conference, the Plastic Age, and so I wanted to start here and talking a little bit about that idea of the sort of layering of meaning and the personal and the nuance and the voice, all of that, which Jake spoke about so well. This is one where it's sort of a surface look that's very obvious. The scenery here is based on the city dump, and all this blowing plastic, and everything she's wearing is made of plastic. But the mood of the piece is very positive, and it's kind of warm and inviting. And in a way, I like that idea. For me and my personal voice is I'm always an optimist. I think no matter how bad things are, and so much of futurist vision is of something very bleak, but I do really still have hope and belief that we can do things. And for me, this is a kind of a portrait of youth. And one of the things that I find most beautiful about youth is that resilience, that sense that they can do something better than what's been done before, that they can make something of this wreck. So she's got this really quite wonderful costume made up of all kinds of garbage, and particularly the bodice in blue, which you might all recognize these days as being discarded medical masks. And the lovely red bustier is actually made from hot water bottles. And that actually is a real piece that a wonderful dancer, Kelly Van Dam, who does wonderful costumes, had actually made that piece. So it made such a beautiful centerpiece of something that was lovely, but made from just this trash. And then that sense of optimism and that kind of joyous discovery and the sense of being able to sort of survive everything, that I think is one of the beauties of the young. So I had this multiple kind of idea going on. It's a bit of a portrait, it's a bit of a apocalyptic image, but also for me the element of hope. Now I'm trying to move forward and it's not working. Oh, there we go. So this is kind of the other end of it. This one is called Battle Cry. And this image is an image, to me, it's the kind of a companion piece in a way. It's the resilience of age. And it's a very different thing. It's much darker vision. It's not so optimistic and sunny. I was actually thinking of Leonard Cohen's wonderful words about the awful truth which you can't reveal to the ears of youth. And that is the way that the world is really falling apart, that our bodies fall apart. When you're young, you might know intellectually that you will die and all of your works will perish, but you don't really feel it in your bones, in your viscera, the way that you do when you're old. And yet, those of us who are, a little silver-haired, do have that knowledge. But to me, again, the beauty and the strength is that most of us don't despair. Most of us, nonetheless, get up in the morning, face the day, no matter all of the pains and aches and losses that we suffer, and move forward, that we can kind of cry defiance against all of the darkness and still carry on, even though we know that so much of what we do is futile and ephemeral. So again, it's maybe a darker looking vision, and yet there is an underlying optimism to it. And I wanted to point out a little bit, the basic figure in the center, that sort of egg shape, egg is such a wonderful symbol because it's a source of something new, something hidden, but something new. And this one is full of a kind of a lava, which again is a very destructive force. But even in destruction, they're kind of the seeds of growth, that new things can come from it. So it's kind of thinking of a lot of these kinds of symbolic elements. And even if you kind of look down at the bottom, there's one of these ladles that's very specifically meant for working with metal. So I kind of put that in as a little hint that something can be made of even all of this darkness and pain and war and grief and all of the things that we have to suffer. So I've always been kind of fond of this piece, but it's a little bit of an odd image, I think, but I like it. This one is on the same kind of theme, and it's still the sort of sense of the environment and how the world is, full of all this darkness and destruction. But I wanted to kind of look at a different take in this one. So there's still that kind of an egg-shaped form there, but instead of being something that's kind of more open, it's a very enclosed metal kind of a thing, a very defensive kind of a thing. And that's actually what I was thinking of this as being like a bubble, like a cocoon that somebody's created this form around them to protect them from this dark, kind of greasy, damaged world. And so for me, the take that I had on this one, I'm thinking about that sense of fear that people have. And you look at, for example, Trump's America with that emphasis on building a wall, keeping everything out, as if you could somehow keep out the world and have all this nice, cozy little privileged, happy little place where all of these troublesome things don't come in and bother you. And so that's the sense of this fearful figure that's not trying to engage with the world or make anything better, just kind of trying to make themselves safe. And yet the vehicle that he's traveling in is actually all made, if you look in a little closely, you can maybe see all these animals that make it up. And all of these are either endangered species or extinct species. So it's by the very action of creating this cocoon of safety and security for ourselves, we're actually creating more of the problem that we're trying to escape from, that we're in this horrible catch-22 that we have to engage in the world. We can't just hive ourselves off from it. So I like to think of it as dealing with global warming by turning up the air conditioning. It's really not a solution. So that's kind of a more of a negative view, I guess, or an awful warning that we need to pay a little more attention to what we're doing. So this piece is it's an older piece, and I wanted to talk about this one a little bit in terms of the other three were very much about sort of the environment, but then there was all this kind of personal things and whatnot that kind of come into it, my personal worldview. And this one I wanted to talk a little bit about how art kind of transmutes as you go along. And if it's too illustrative and too simple, I think sometimes people are confused by weird art like this because it is, well, what does it mean? It looks so confusing. But it's more about painting an emotion. And the actual narrative is a little bit more oblique or hidden, that you almost have to kind of contribute that in a way from your own experience. So this actually has a very specific meaning to me. And the only hint to it is actually in those two sort of towers of blue that are near the center and to the left. And that was actually meant to kind of reference those blue lights that were put up as monuments to the fall of the Twin Towers in New York. And this painting actually came up out of that, the aftermath of 9/11, that what I sensed was this incredible feeling of panic, that I think everyone was kind of going along like, yes, there's trouble in the Middle East, yes, there's trouble in Africa, but it doesn't really impact on us in any way. It's over there, far away, somebody else. And then all of a sudden it came onto our doorstep, and suddenly everyone felt vulnerable. And the reality that we are all interconnected was suddenly made very obvious. And so to me, this is a response to that feeling of panic and anxiety. It's called the Age of Anxiety. But I didn't want it to be just an illustration or a very literal thing. I think art actually loses a little power when it's too literal and it's too clearly, oh, this is a story about something that happened. So I did put that little hint with the blue lights, but I didn't really want it to be obvious. What I wanted to have as being obvious was that feeling of sort of anxiety and distance from sort of the natural world and grounding. So I painted this very urban feeling kind of a space, and the person kind of taken apart a little bit and very disassociative in the way that the body is presented, sort of out of touch with his own body, out of touch with the food production. So everything very artificial and everything really um, uh, full of that sense of being completely helpless. So that was my thinking with this. And I think that is a kind of a common theme through a lot of contemporary fiction as well, that sense of dislocation, of being unattached to the world and to others. This piece is called The Weight of History. And I put this one in because I wanted to talk a little bit about how things change sometimes and how other influences come into your work. I started this one originally, it was actually had a different title. It was called The House of Pain. And I had this vision, and this sort of story that I had was this black sculpture with rain kind of pouring down or water pouring down over it, this sort of slightly screaming face. And then this strong figure, but that was all bound up in ropes and unable to move forward. And this was a very personal thing because it happened when I was in my middle 40s. I suddenly got this rampaging arthritis. So I had pain in every joint from being somebody that was a sort of a fairly extreme exerciser. Suddenly everything hurt when I moved. And I just felt like I couldn't move, that I was constricted and restrained. And so that was where the painting started. And that was the personal element. But I think in order to have power, art has to transcend the personal. And for me, this kind of came through the actual model that I found for it. I always have an idea when I'm painting, and then I have to find that person that kind of fits my idea. I don't usually start from the person. Occasionally I do, but generally I start from the idea, and then I seek out the model. And in this case, I was looking for someone that had that sense of sturdy physicality that I wanted to have, and then constrict. Finally, I did find this wonderful model, Jillian, and beautiful dancer, really strong body. And so as I cast her in this play of mine, she changed the dynamic by the simple fact that she is a person of color, that she's got her wonderful actual coloration from her Celtic mother, but the very Negroid features of her Nigerian father. So suddenly you get this element of race. And that is like, oh yeah, that works too. That is that sense of constriction. And it suddenly then changed to the weight of history. And it came back in a way to myself in that she's also a woman. And I think that's something that I often deal with in my work, that sense of how women's and girls' lives have been so constricted and kept down in the same way that people of color, people of different gender affiliations or sexuality have been really restricted and kept from leading their fullest life. And so I certainly resonated with it. It had a reality to me that I felt, even though some of that reality was not mine, but it belonged to Jillian, to having to live in this world where there are sometimes very negative expectations placed and very strong restrictions placed on people who don't fit the sort of average, normal, white view of the world. So so this painting has actually kind of changed and grown, and I think had different levels and depths. But I think anyone that looks at it can bring their own history. Everyone has that knowledge. Like, it is universal to feel that you're prevented from moving forward by some force outside yourself, something historical, sense of what can be done. I'm sure a lot of white men feel very restricted now because of the attention paid to people who are struggling to have their voice heard. Everybody has that sense of restriction sometimes, but I think a lot of people have it way worse than others. And it is something that's really important to bring to the mix, is the fact that now we're starting to hear and see a lot of work from a variety of sources, so that we're getting a much more nuanced view. Some of the things that Sherry, oh, I've got her last name wrong, Dimison, I've got that wrong, I'm sure. spoke about yesterday about her work it was so rich and beautiful to hear her experience as a Métis person now mainstream. It's not just a little niche thing. She's got a very popular book that's read by many. It's not just a tiny little group. It's become mainstream. And I think that's a wonderful addition that we have this richness starting to happen now where everybody can show what they think or feel, and it's starting to be heard. So I think that's a wonderful, it's a long way to go, but it's coming. And I think that's something that's very, very valuable. This is an older painting of mine that I'm very fond of. It's called Only Human. And I put this one in because I wanted to talk a little bit about something that often doesn't get talked about in contemporary art, and maybe, I don't know about literature, but certainly in contemporary art, the skills of the creator are often not really remarked. I mean, we talk about people's passion. We tend to talk about our passion for what we're doing or the meaning that it has for us. And the ideas are often discussed, but the actual skill that a writer brings, the wordsmith brings to their story, or that the painter brings to their craft, is a really important part of creating that vision. So I wanted to show this one because I think this is a very nice example of that. The title Only Human it's fairly obvious. There's a rather bedeviled looking person there who has the wings of an angel, but also the hoofs of the devil. So there's that real sense of, here's the only human is to be caught between these extremes. But that then the sort of tools of the trade of how you enhance and create that a kind of a place, a structure for that idea to live in, as it's the tools of the artist. And this one, I think, shows it a little more clearly than most. Generally speaking, our readers or our viewers are not aware of the structure of skill that we all use to build a home for these ideas. But they really are important. So in this case, those kind of skills are things like just the symbolism, the fact that he's at the top of a mountain, so he's between the sky and the ground, gives that sense of that dichotomy of sky and ground. The color is really important. It is made all entirely of sort of shades of blue and orange, which are opposites on the color wheel. And when they're mixed together, they create all of the subtle shades of gray. But when you separate them, they create the greatest sort of drama of conflict. And then the landscape itself. And this is a landscape that I remember from my youth, but doesn't really exist anymore. And it was the Drumheller area used to have an awful lot of these structures, which are called hoodoos. And there aren't so many anymore. There are a few, but not like there used to be. I remember them just thickly clustered like this. So I wanted to paint that landscape because, again, it's that dichotomy. It's rock, so it's hard, but it's eroded so that these pillow-like forms are all very soft. So there's, again, that sense of duality happening kind of in every level of the painting. So that's why I wanted to put that one in. And I think I probably don't have much time left, so I should maybe skip through a little bit. This is called Perilous Journey. And again, it's got that very personal element. I did a whole series of work about a relative of mine who suffered from bipolar problems and saw the world as a very dark place, but yet would somehow always thrust himself into these dangerous kind of places. So I've got him going out to sea in a paper boat, but definitely it might be a little hidden behind the screen for you, but there's always that element of hope to me. There's the little lighthouse at the very, very back on the horizon, kind of dim. But I always feel it's important as a creator to not be totally negative, that even when things look very black, I think we always have to make sure we have that little bit of hope. So I think my time is just about over. I did want to move forward to just one more. I'll just skip that one before I give this back. And this is one I wanted to include at the very end because it is an illustration. It's Alice in Wonderland's Alice when she got very big and broke the house apart. So it's very illustrative of a particular thing that we're all familiar with from literature. But I think that's one of the things that's wonderful about the confluence of literature and visual art and any art form is how we speak to each other and borrow and echo back and forth. And I think that this piece has that really nice sense that to me it felt very real and true as that essence of how I think we've all felt at times, especially when we were young, that the world is too small for us and we want to break out and be in a bigger space, or the opposite where we're fearful and feel like the world is overwhelming us. We've all known that experience. So I think that universality of that imagery from Alice in Wonderland is a wonderful thing that he brought to the world in literature, but many people have worked with as visual art because it is so rich and beautiful. So I don't want to impose on Laura's time. So I think that was my time. And I thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to getting some questions from you later. Thank you. Now I have to stop sharing. And I think that worked.
Okay, thank you very much, Iris. I think there's a lot to be picked up on there, and thank you for that. But we are going to go through to Laura because we are a little bit tight on time now, and I think it's going to be a very interesting move from that this process of the painting tied to symbolism and direct relationships to a photographic practice that engages in a very different kind of narrative and character development. So I'm just going to introduce Laura quickly, and it's quite easy for me to do because I've known Laura for some time now as an artist, and we've crossed paths before, so quite differently than Iris, who's new to me now today. So Laura completed her Master of Fine Arts degree at Concordia in Montreal, as did I, and her work can be found in public and private collections across Canada. She's exhibited throughout the country and abroad, most recently at the Remy Modern, Vivian Art in Calgary, Stuart Hall Gallery in Montreal, and the Art Gallery of Alberta. She teaches as a sessional instructor at the University of Saskatchewan and is currently working on an augmented reality project with support from the Canada Council for the Arts. Her presentation includes pieces from Urban Vernacular, a series of cobbled together dwellings or structures located on the fringes of urban space. Spectral Garden, involving preserved flora from ecologically sensitive landscapes, including the boreal forest, and The Sowers, which depicts interventions in the urban environment in the form of small gardens thriving in unlikely places. The presentation draws parallels between narrative and world building in photography, video, and literary forms of speculative fiction, exploring the potential of the arts as agents of change in the climate crisis. Thank you, Laura, for being here.
Thank you so much, Jake, for that introduction. And thank you, Wendy, for inviting me. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today. It's a real pleasure. I have been reading speculative fiction since I could write a paragraph. So it's just such a pleasure to participate in the conference, fangirling while I'm watching some of the other presentations. And I grew up without the internet. So I read a lot. My family didn't have a lot of money, and my childhood wasn't super pleasant. So I spent a lot of time in books. And it was really speculative fiction that drew me in to reading. And you know, the alternative realities of people like Orson Scott Card, C.S. Lewis, Anthony Pierce. There were a lot of white guys in the library, authors in the library in Regina, where I grew up. So these kinds of books, it really encouraged me to create an alternate reality for myself. And so I so appreciate the work of writers and those who think about writing and fiction particularly. And although I'm a visual artist, this lifelong love of the genre has really had a significant influence on my artistic practice. So I'm going to share some images with you today. And I'm sorry, Jake, I should have clued you in that I actually shortened the presentation because 20 minutes is not very long. I'm only going to include some of my most recent work in the presentation today, which is from the series The Sowers, which I've been working on since about 2018. And these particular images depict interventions in the urban landscape where small gardens thrive in places such as vacant lots or underground parking garages, gravel yards, demolition sites, places where you wouldn't expect a garden to grow. So I'm going to share my screen, and what you'll see from here on in is images, photographs, and videos of my work. Let's see here. Do that. There we go. Someone send me a message if that's not right. This is an older image from the previous body of work, Urban Vernacular, that inspired the most recent body of work. The work that I have been doing since this image, or since this body of work, so since about 2008, so shortly after, a couple of years after I finished graduate school, uses a medium called constructed photography. And that's photography where I've constructed a scene, much as you would construct a movie set. So this is opposed to a type of, the type of photographic practice that most people are used to, which is more of a documentary practice. So in the latter, the artist documents a specific moment in time to reveal some kind of truth or visual that you wouldn't have access to normally. An example of that would be Ed Bertinsky's aerial photographs of strip mines or tailing ponds, for example. So while all of you writers out there have a choice between writing fiction and nonfiction, I've made a similar choice within the realm of photography when I opted to use constructed photography instead of documentary photography. Before I dive in to sort of the main theme of my talk, I'll just note that there are a number of lines of inquiry in my work, and 20 minutes isn't very long, so I'm not going to go into all of them in depth. But first and foremost, you'll note as we go through the work that my main question is how we as humans relate to the natural world. Yesterday in Saskatoon, the smoke from forest fires up north was so thick that we couldn't really go outside. We couldn't breathe. My child has asthma, so we stayed inside. What does it mean to be alive right now as the planet sort of teeters on the edge of environmental collapse? What's my responsibility? What's my role? This is the question that preoccupies me the most. Are there ways that we as humans can engage with the natural world to understand it better, to feel more a part of it? Secondly, what is a photograph? How do I use this medium? As you'll see in the images that I'm going to show you, I'm exploring photography as image, but also in the context of installation, and also how it relates to time-based media like video. With these explorations, I'm interested in how to maximize the emotional and sensory impact of the work, as well as communicating certain concepts. So for example, the image that I'm showing you right now is a mural. It's roughly 8.5 feet high by 25 feet wide. And the way it was installed and lit, when you saw it at the Art Gallery of Alberta, you actually, for a moment, when you first saw it, you felt like, oh, I'm actually seeing a real landscape. So there's a very sensory relationship to the image, sort of a haptic relationship to the image, as well as a visual and conceptual one. And these are sort of the things that I'm interested in exploring with photography. Finally, the third thing that preoccupies me is the potential of the human imagination. So how does it work? How does it nourish us? How do we access it to imagine possible futures? At this point in history, again, with the environmental concerns that face us, we as artists, I think, can harness the power of the imagination to propose better ways of living. So that really preoccupies me as well. So today, within the context of this conference, I'll mostly address the last question that I raised. So that of the imagination and how it relates to the and how my work relates to the influence of speculative fiction, and what that speculative fiction, how it's influenced my work. I mentioned off the top that I read a lot of speculative fiction as a child. I'll just show you a detail of this work while I continue to speak here. but you know, these images, especially these large, some of them are quite large, like this one. There are a lot of pixels here. So I spend a lot of time, what I call mining pixels. So I spend a lot of time on the computer, and I try to maximize that time by listening to audiobooks and podcasts and other things. And a lot of that is speculative fiction. So Audible loves me. My Audible library is quite thorough. Um, so I won't go on at length about how I put these images together, but in order to get the resolution required to put these images together, um, I shoot panoramically. So that's to say that I have, you know, a fairly good digital camera, but I might shoot up to 200 or 300 images, photographs, and then assemble them at a later time. I do use a computer program to help me put these together, but the computer program isn't infallible and needs some help. So I do a lot of it manually. I also, in addition to assembling the panorama, will add or remove elements using Photoshop to create the feeling that I want to get from the image. So I might, to increase the mood of isolation, I might remove a building or change its size. In each of the images that I've already shown you, or in the image that I've already shown you, or the images that I will show you, you can be sure that I've removed things, added things, multiplied things, changed things, emphasized things, cropped certain things out. You know, I've used every trick in the book to create the image that I want to elicit a certain response from the person who's looking at the image. So in this sense, I'm moving even further away from the kind of photo that you might take with your phone, right? With an undoctored image. And I also see these as, we could call them collages, digital collages, or in some senses, they could be considered digital paintings with the degree of manipulation that's gone on. So when I am often listening to podcasts, I like to listen to interviews with writers. I find I identify more with the writing process than I do with a lot of artists and the artistic process that they describe. And part of that is because of the way writers will describe the way that they build worlds, the world building process, which is a term that sometimes is overused, I think. Here I'm not going all out like, J.R.R. Tolkien with the maps and the languages and the races and the genealogies. But I am constructing a very specific world that is based on our own, but maybe just one step to the left of what we see in our contemporary world. And the clues that I'm offering tell you that there might be something dystopian going on here. For example, the landscapes that I'm presenting you with are mostly devoid of life outside of these little makeshift greenhouses or shelters that have been constructed by someone to house the green life that we see here. And so I want the viewer to ask, why are the plants covered? Is the air poisoned? Is water scarce? Does it need to be contained? Most of the photographs are captured at night or at sunrise or at sunset. So where is the sun? Are we encountering a situation as in Cixin Liu's Three Body Problem, that novel, where there's a prolonged period of darkness? What's happened to the sun? Much like an author, I would keep these details consistent from chapter to chapter, or in a series from novel to novel. I'm wondering, or I'm trying to keep them consistent from image to image throughout the series, and building, continuing to build the world as the series develops. There's a detail of the plants growing in this particular image. I also set the images in urban space. So these are places that are a little out of the way, or places no one would necessarily live. So maybe we can imagine the gardens would remain hidden if they needed to, or, you know, for some reason they're a little bit, they're not, you know, in the middle of things. I'm not one of those people who necessarily pines for David Thoreau's untouched wilderness. As humans, you know, we've been altering the landscape for a very, very, very long time, thousands and thousands of years. So I don't necessarily believe that we should all, you know, pick up stakes and move to the woods or the hills and live off the grid. But I do think that we need to find better ways of, you know, living within with the natural world, understanding the natural world, and finding our realistic and realistic place within it, I guess. So the idea of inserting this life into dead urban spaces is a symbol of resilience. It's a symbol of hope, and it's a symbol of change for me in a world that I'm depicting that is otherwise quite bleak. This is an actual demolition site, and those vehicles are actually images of another project I did where I turned 8 defunct vehicles into greenhouses that house native plants. So I decided to combine these two images together to create this new image. And one place where I think that we can, as humans, really learn about our place in the natural world and work this relationship out in a way that's realistic and maybe might work for our current times with the technology that we have, is the garden. So that's why I've used the garden a lot in these works. You know, I think we tend to think of gardening as a very superficial or sort of quaint pastime, but I think getting your hands in the dirt and try to grow a bit of food for yourself, for the creatures that live around you, it can really teach you a lot about how the natural world works and how to collaborate with it, with the non-human. I don't know about you, but it's been a very strange year for gardening in Saskatoon. And I'm personally very glad that I do not have to live off of what has succeeded in my own vegetable garden, because all we would have this winter would be pumpkins and carrots. And I think we would probably all turn orange. So as you know, if you're a gardener, you know that, you know, if you're not a gardener, you might think that gardeners have a lot of control of what goes on in the garden. But as actual, you know, if you have had a garden, you know that so much depends on what happens with, you know, the weather and the bugs and you know, just random things. We don't really understand what's going on. This year there were no strawberries. Nobody knows why. So here's another image of a garden inserted into a defunct cabinet making shop up for sale in a neighborhood in Saskatoon. So back to the question at hand, another parallel to writing in my work is the creation of a fictional character. So this is a little bit more unusual in visual art. We see it a little bit more in time-based work, such as performance art or video art or machinima, for example. And the artists that I find doing this in the most interesting way are largely our Indigenous artists. So like Laurie Blondeau, Thurza Cuthand, Scowanetti, for example, although Laurie Blondeau does also use photography and her fictional characters in her work. I know that as a visual artist, the assumption is that, you know, especially in something like photography, the assumption is that if I'm taking a photograph of something, it's because I actually saw it. Or, you know, if I present a sculpture, it's because I actually made it. It's a little bit more difficult for people to wrap their heads around the idea that, you know, there's an imaginary character that I've created that makes the thing, that makes, in this case, the garden, and I'm the artist, Laura, and I take a picture of it. So it makes writing grant applications a little more complicated than it maybe is for some other people. But as with the world building here, with the development of this character, I remain intentionally vague. And I think that's partly because I want, oh, here's another image here of an underground parking garage here. I want the character, I want the viewer to sort of identify with the character a little bit. So to that extent, I don't want to develop the character. Here's an image of the character that I've created in this series. I don't want the character to be too developed because I'm hoping that the viewer will be able to identify to some extent with the character. So fill in some of the details, fill in some of the blanks. And that's one of the privileges that we have in visual art, is that we can decide to leave certain things to the imagination of the viewer. Maybe a little bit more, maybe in the discussion period, we can have a discussion about this, might be fun. But I think you can leave a little bit more, you know, to chance, or a little bit, you can maybe offer fewer details. So this character is me, and I've decided to use my own body because the use of the female body in Western art, as in the history of Western art, is so problematic. You know, we can also discuss that if you want more information about that. But so I decided to use my own body to avoid a lot of the conundrums that can go along with using someone else's body, particularly someone who doesn't come from the same background as me. Here's another. This is the last work I'll show you today, and that I showed at the Remy Modern in Saskatoon. And it again is a mural-sized work. What I've done with this work is I've made other videos, but with this work I have shown it. I've created an installation in conjunction with a video. So the work actually has two parts. It has the photograph and the video work. And so the photograph is a still image, obviously. The video work is a time-based image. And I'm trying to figure out how to get those those two things to work together. And so this was one step towards the virtual reality project that I'm working on right now that Jake mentioned in the introduction. So I'm going to just show you a quick detail here, and then I'll just quickly exit out of here, and I will show you a just 1 minute, I think, of the video that you would see if you were looking through the viewer. Hold on, maybe do I have one more slide here? Oh, sorry, I do have one more slide. So if you're looking through this landscape viewer, you will see a video. You won't actually see the photograph. You'll see a video. So you can see here, there's a little video playing here. And this is the video that you will see. Doesn't have any sound. So one thing with the sewer is that as the character develops, she really places her own comfort below. She prioritizes the gardens above her own comfort. So there's one video where she's laying in the dirt, watching, you know, taking care of the plants, sleeping alongside the plants to make sure they're okay. Here she has placed dirt in her mouth and has planted seeds from the wheat that surrounds her in her mouth, and has incubated those seeds in her mouth. And so they have sprouted in her mouth and grown in her mouth as she has warmed them with the light. no plants were harmed in the making of this video. So the video is a full 3 minutes long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing because, again, 20 minutes is quite a short time, and I think my time is up. But so I'll leave it there, and we can maybe just jump into questions. But I did want to just, and just saying, the importance of, I get asked this all the time. So I did want to address it before we jump to questions. And, people say to me, well, you talk about, the environment and art and, do you really think your work can make a difference? And I do. Bill McKibben, one of the most important, I think, climate activists and writers of our time, said, in 2005, before a lot of people started making work about the environment, said, where are the artists? And I think we do have a lot of artists now making work about the environment. And another thing that we hear a lot is that the problems with climate change, the fact that we haven't, succeeded in doing anything about climate change, it's a failure of imagination. So I do think that's our territory as artists. And so I think that's what we have to do. We have to harness that power of imagination and go with it. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Laura. So we now have a few minutes left to have a bit of a discussion, and I would invite any participants that would like to put something into the Q&A to please do so. And I also would welcome you. I'll be watching the chat as well, just in case. So I see some thank yous are coming up, and really appreciate that support and engagement of the people that are here. And also to both Laura and Iris for presenting such differing perspectives within what might be described as a genre of working. So I'd like to maybe just draw on a couple of those things. And, Laura ended kind of where I began, with this idea of the failure of imagination. And there's also this desire to demand utility of all bodies, and including artists must become provide their utility in somehow coming to solution, as opposed to creating the conditions that will allow for things to change. And I think that's so much of what happens within the fictions of art making, is that they start to create the conditions that allow for change. And much as we've heard throughout the conference, this idea of being able to like even to take the weight of oppression off for a few moments, as Cherie was describing as the Wakanda effect. But then in this kind of work that's addressing, Laura specifically thinking about climate change and responsibilities of ourselves and moving beyond the human, like you allowing us to see this image of potential futures, whether they be the sort of dystopian or utopian, because neither exists. There is this potential to say there's otherwise that could exist. So I'm struck by that idea that both of you, Iris and Laura, talk about the idea that you need to reclaim skill and capacity and labor within your practices in order to present these narratives. But I would argue Iris works more with mythologies and Laura works more with contemporalities. You each draw on some things that are well known, like The Sower, of course, for anyone in this genre will immediately think of Octavia Butler, and Iris's Plastic Age. It's hard not to imagine Joan of Arc and other narratives. So you're both drawing on existing narratives from very different places to, in Iris's case, suggest an optimism that is to my mind, a bit troubling, I'll say. And Laura is describing something quite unique in that the kind of care and implication of their own body, the care offered by the body, and the implication of their own body in providing that care. So is there a question in here or a series of observations? I'm not sure. We'll get there. So Wendy's just letting me know that Wendy can't post in the Q&A. So she's asking her question here. So maybe since I'm busy making observations, we'll go to Wendy's question. In her presentation, Iris spoke about always having an element of light in her paintings. Well, in her presentation, Laura spoke of including symbols of change and hope. In literary terms, both of these seem to be an expression of utopian impulse rather than a dystopian. I wonder if you can talk a bit more about this impulse in your visual art and why you see it as important.
Well, for me, I think if you show only the dystopian side, uh, then people will despair and think, well, there's nothing to be done, so why bother? And I think if we want to make some kind of a call for action to have our art have some kind of impact, you have to have some shred of hope that you can make something better, that we can make better choices, that we can do something, even though it's maybe a very thin hope, and sometimes the work is very dark. I think even you have to have that little kernel, otherwise you just give into despair. And then I think, of what value is that? Because despair just means you sit and do nothing. So for me, it is quite important that you have both. As an aphorism I always liked, which is, things are seldom as good as you hope or as bad as you fear. And I think that's true. It's easy to wallow in darkness and say, well, you just look at the world, it's awful. But the world is resilient and people are resilient. And when we really pay attention to something, it can change. So I think we have to have some shred of hope in our art. If it's strictly bleak, then we're doomed, I think.
Laura, do you want to take up that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, Jake, in the sense I don't really believe in utopia or dystopia. I think, in the darkest times we find light, and in the lightest times there's also dark. And so, but there has, there we do have to. I agree with Iris too, that we do have to find ways to look. And so that's why I'm so interested in the garden, right, as a way to move that, as a metaphor, but also as a practical thing. Like, get rid of your lawn, plant a thing, learn how to make it grow. That's a start. It's practical, but it's very, very educational, but in a profound way that it will actually change you if you do it. So I don't know if that answers Wendy's question, but I'm not really that interested in the utopian.
Yeah, I think you're working towards a legitimate change, and that change is possible. Like, we can speak things into being, first of all.
Yeah, but it's gonna be messy. It's messy. It's so messy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's and I think that if we have the illusion that it's going to be anything but messy, we'll just be disappointed and we'll give up.
Good point.
It's the desire that there won't be cost to this engagement. There's several questions that refer again to the light, and this is such a common symbolism of positivity is the light. But I just want to pick this up because Lorraine Salt is asking, Laura, if you use light with plants and gardens in enclosed spaces, can you discuss the significance of the light, please?
Hi, Lorraine. Well, the light is important in a number of ways. So just from an aesthetic point of view, it allows the spaces to be transformed so that these kind of mundane, everyday spaces can be viewed in a different way. So the landscape is transformed. So these are spaces often that we walk by all the time. They're like the back of a big box store, or they're like an underground parkade, or just all these kind of weird places that most people don't really see. Like you walk by them but you don't see them. So that's important. But also as just this idea of there are years where volcanoes erupted, in our history as humans, where volcanoes erupted and we couldn't grow anything. And really, that is how fragile our livelihood is. So that's a very interesting idea to me, that even just that idea of, we need the sun to grow things, to be able to eat and survive. Just that simple, very simple idea is really important to me. So that's, for me, that's why the light's so important.
I'm going to pick up on the utopian dystopian because Jonathan Sawatsky here has posted a comment that I think is worth investigating in a big way. Jonathan states the closing pages of Wabgeshig Rice's novel Moon of Crusted Snow suggests Indigenous people have experienced many apocalypses. How do you think your work positions itself within apocalypse, post-apocalypse? Are we watching it end or surviving a collapse?
Well, I mean, I don't think I mean, yeah, we haven't reached collapse yet. I mean, we can waltz through a pandemic and still order things on Amazon. I think we're pretty good so far.
That's dystopian.
Well, things are certainly going in a very scary direction, and between the climate and all kinds of things that are happening, this sort of almost a rise of the sort of fascist right that's going to be keeping borders up that shouldn't be. There's a lot of dark things happening, but then that's history, right? There's all kinds of terrible things have happened. I mean, the Black Plague wiped out most of Europe, and then it came back. So I think we sometimes overestimate our power. People say we're destroying the world. We don't have the power to destroy the world. The world can destroy us, but we cannot destroy the world. But we can sure make it really miserable to live on. So I think we have to try to do our part for just purely selfish reasons. We need to act to prevent the complete collapse. But there's an awful lot of stuff going on. Like global climate change is here. It's not coming. It's here, and we certainly notice it. Just take a breath outside right now, and you can smell it on the air. So we are kind of in the midst of what could lead to a collapse of civilization. But as you say, it hasn't happened yet. We're still functional, and we're still delivering programs to people, and we don't have millions and millions and millions of people just keeling over from starvation yet. But we really have to pay attention, because the climate is going to determine our future.
I think, Jonathan,
you answers the question, but
John makes an interesting point in that, that Moon of Crusted Snow is an excellent example, just in reminding us that some people and communities have experienced, genocide and other forms of apocalypse, and are much better positioned to survive other forms of profound disruption. So I think it's very interesting to see how those communities respond, and I think how those communities respond is with community, right? Like pulling together and sharing, and like an emphasis on community rather than individuality. And the pandemic has been sort of an interesting example of that, right? Where to see which communities band together and help, and which communities where everybody like isolates themselves and sort of holds on tight to their own resources, and sort of hoards and like hoards all the hand sanitizer and tries to make a profit, right? Like it's been very fascinating to see who behaves in what way, and like will that be a harbinger for how things play out if and when things get more serious, right? Because we're not out of the pandemic yet either.
No.
Certainly, and he definitely points to this understanding of we, and some of these clarifications around us and we, and when that's said so casually, pointing to these kinds of moments where, well, just thinking about the Anthropocene, which has been so heavily misused term, and thinking when you look at where its start point has been identified as in 16th century with the mass killings of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island and in Central South America. So there was enough colonial devastation that it actually changed the climate for us. And it's also suggesting opportunities to look at the post-human. And so the ideas of end of civilization. Does that mean the end of this species and our species as a particularly extractive creature? Is it time for that to be over? Whereas you look at the survivance or thrivance of Indigenous cultures that have not chosen to hyper individuate, you definitely see that shift occurring. So I think it's I think we're at a moment of unique engagement, and I think both of these bodies of works kind of refer to different takes on those potentialities. Like what will it be, that mythological potential that Iris is drawing from, that actually leads to one of the questions I want to get to, and the more truly speculative work of Laura's. So I'm just going to refer back to, excuse me, I'm not sure if it's Kai or Kay, Monk Mackenzie. What meaning do you associate, this is for Iris, what meaning do you associate with the fortress castle with flags in the background of battle cry? And are there other words of writers that inspire your work aside from those of Leonard Cohen?
Oh, I think everything you read, every movie you see, everything, every kind of art form kind of comes in and kind of informs your ideas. So yes, there are definitely other things. In regards to the flags in the battle, I think because I that particular painting is called Battle Cry, and I wanted to have that sense of the destruction of war, and so I had that element of these the people fighting as a backdrop, but not as the main element. Although the main protagonist in there is carrying a sword. I don't know if you noticed that, or a very rough one, um, and that sense of a battle. So I was thinking of it as kind of a metaphor for in a way, the battle of life, you might say, to be very uh, uh, kind of simplistic, but also just that there is that sense of destruction in life, and there is so much destruction, but that there is still that transcendence of destruction, that even in the most awful devastation, there's something that will come from that. So I wanted that sense of something awful happening and things burning and battles going on, and yet this person somehow surviving, and then a future somehow coming from even this horrible experience.
I know that we're over time, but there are still more questions. Um, what is the feeling, Wendy? Are we allowed to go over time, or?
Yeah, Wendy here. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Wendy. Thank you.
We started late, so yes, I think we can go over. We can go over time. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you to everyone that's been sticking with us this long, and for your patience with us getting started. So I will like to continue with your questions because it's so valuable when people offer up responses to one another, and I do think that there's a generosity in that position. So thank you for all of the engagement we're seeing here. This is a question from Andrew, and it's for Iris. You mentioned that your work, Age of Anxiety, had some relation to the tensions around 9/11. Given the speculative nature of the conference and maybe the recent events in Afghanistan, how do you view the sense of anxiety in comparison with when the painting was created, either culturally or personally?
Well, that's interesting. In a way, we've kind of regressed to before 9/11. I think we still tend to look at that and say, well, it's over there, it's other people, as opposed to, this is going to impact the world, and nobody will be safe from what will happen there. There will be so much suffering, so many people that will be streaming out of the country, so many people that will suffer in the country. There's going to be an awful lot of spillover. It's not going to just stay neatly contained. And you look at a country like Iran that has, sponsored quite a lot of sort of global terrorism and whatnot. And I can't imagine that the Taliban will be far behind in that. So, we could be looking at another 9/11 at any time. But I do think that the mood is not there yet, that it's still that feeling of, oh, like, we're fine, it's over there, and which I'm a little disappointed that people don't see it as something that's really going to be uh, of global impact. So I guess in a way we have to have things right up in front of us before we pay attention, I suppose. But I don't know really. it's such a complex situation, and I think everybody's just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. But no, that same feeling of anxiety, I don't think is, I don't sense it anyway here. I'm sure it would be in Afghanistan, but we seem to have this feeling that, oh, it's just something that we look at on the news now, not really anything to do with us, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm going to just flag again the idea of we, because I don't feel that way at all. And I feel very
You sense
conscious
a
of,
lot of you sense a lot of anxiety in people around you.
I have a lot of anxiety about this, exceptional amount of anxiety around it. And when I think about the fact that there's been no larger supporter of global terrorism than the United States, I feel actually it's very proximal. So I struggle with that sense of it being something distant from us. And I had
Well,
hoped that if there was something to think about with the virus that could teach us is the borders don't exist, that the air is shared. And so I struggle with that. And I think about anxiety and alienation as being central, particularly like there's evidence of that alienation very much in Laura's work in these sort of disused sort of the remains of industrialization and that sort of separation of the laborer from the product, and then how does the body return to that site of labor. So I cut you off, Iris. I just wanted to sort of complete that
no,
thought.
no, but I agree that I think people who are paying attention, like yourself, are feeling that panic. But what I'm saying is, I don't sense it in the broad public, which I think, there's always those few that are really paying attention that do say, "Whoa, this is going to be bad." But I think a lot of people, it's just, oh well, something more on the news. So so my take isn't that it isn't that it's there's anxiety and whatnot, but I think it isn't widespread, which is what I was trying to get at. That I think not enough people feel as you do that. Whoa, this is huge. I think an awful lot of people are just kind of, oh, it's the news.
Mm-hmm. So we are at 3:52. So maybe that's far enough over time that we can conclude there. And I'm getting that sense. And so I think we will wrap up there. Obviously, there's much more to discuss here because the works themselves and the comments are always generating further thinking in and around what it is to either make images and representations of that which has already been or that which we wish to bring into being. And I'm really grateful for both Iris and Laura for being here and sharing so much of their work. And I'd like to also thank the sponsors of the event. And I'd like to make